So, here I'm going to be looking at how Thomas Aquinas might have responded to Rene Descartes' methodology and methodological doubt had they not been separated by about 400 years. I'd wanted to look into Thomas's epistemology for this project, but going through the entirety of what he had to say and write about epistemology and related topics, well, that would be well beyond the scope of anything I can cover here. It'd be quite exhausting. So it occurred to me that a great way to narrow this topic would be to simply compare Aquinas' epistemological outlook to that of Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, and then speculate how Aquinas would have responded to Descartes had he came later or the two been contemporaries. So to begin with, let's start with some basic information on both men here. That's a picture of Aquinas there. He was born in 1225 and died in 1274, about 49 years old, almost made it to 50. He studied under St. Albert the Great. He both taught and studied at the University of Paris. And he's almost certainly best known for the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles, which are quite extensive. However, he wrote much more than just that. He's said to have written nearly 10 million words, and I think to the best of my knowledge, some of the things he wrote haven't even been translated into English even now. Now, there are a lot of interesting and good stories about Aquinas, but one that I thought would be good here is that when he decided to become a Dominican, his family actually balked and demanded that he not do so. His family was Italian nobility of some type, and they apparently had other plans for him. So adamant were they about this that they actually held him captive in their family castle for a year or two, and the story goes that his brothers were so determined to rid him of this desire to be a Dominican that they actually hired a prostitute and put her into the room where they were holding him there. But the story also says that Aquinas chased her out of there and remained chaste, and then stayed in the room until a year or two later when his family yielded, and he went on to become a Dominican and do all the great writing and philosophy that we know him for now. Now to Rene Descartes, we got a picture of him there. He was born in France in 1596 and died at 1650 at the age of 53. He had originally studied to become a lawyer. He spent some time in the Dutch military. He seemed to move around a lot in his history. He seemed to have trouble settling in any one place. He is probably best known for meditations on first philosophy and the discourse on method, although, once again, he wrote a considerable amount of other things. Part of that is that he did some work in mathematics and geometry that provided some of the basis for what later would become calculus. Now, there's a rather tragic story about Descartes in that he actually died because he was teaching. The Queen of Sweden had invited him to her court to tutor her, and of course he went because who wouldn't want the chance to teach some royalty? But unfortunately this was in the winter, and these lessons were taking place at 5 a.m. in a cold castle. And from this he seems to have caught pneumonia and died of infection. So I think part of the moral of Descartes' story we can take is that no education or philosophy should ever take place before the sun rises, because that literally killed the father of modern philosophy. So, Rene Descartes is generally called the father of modern philosophy, or the founder of modern philosophy, by both Bertrand Russell and pretty much everyone else whose opinion on this subject matters. Both Descartes' critics and his disciples agree on this point. Generally speaking, the reason for giving Descartes this grand title is the attempt he made at remaking philosophy in his discourse on method and meditations of first philosophy. Speaking generally again, what Descartes was trying to do is remake philosophy so that it would become more like the scientific method. He wanted to do this because he was very put off by all the disagreements in philosophy and admired the certainty that the scientific method seemed to be producing. So Ralph McInerny summed up what Descartes started with here in this observation that Descartes observed, "Our senses sometimes deceive us. You thought something was flat only to realize it's convex, and the stick in the water looks bent. We sometimes think something has this or that quality and we're deceived." And since all of our knowledge comes from our senses, Descartes then wondered how we can claim certainty about any of our knowledge or beliefs that we have. So that's what he determined there. And here's a great example of this. You can see this picture here. It looks like the guy is on the edge of an ice cliff about to fall off, but that's actually a really, really clever and skillfully done painting that gives the illusion of that. You could walk right across that if you were standing there. So, how do we know we aren't being deceived? Well, Descartes determined he's going to solve this problem for us. And the way Descartes is going to solve this is he determined he's going to doubt everything. He's going to doubt all things and see if there's anything that can't be doubted, which he can then know for certain. Now, from this process here, so he's doubting everything there. So in this process here, he determined that he couldn't successfully doubt his own existence because there had to be somebody there doing the doubting. And that gave him the cogito ergo sum, I think I am. And then he sought to rebuild everything based on this foundation, which he thought was unshakable and certain. Because then he can build it all up, he's got a good foundation, so we're back in the world again. Now, loosely speaking, the way he did this was to devise a type of ontological argument for God's existence, and then conclude that God must be good in order to be God, and since God would not deceive him, he can trust his senses. However, things didn't really go the way Descartes thought they would, the way he hoped and expected they would from this. He was trying to find a way to defeat all skepticism. In doing this, he tried to one-up the skeptic by effectively saying, you doubt this and this, well, I doubt everything that can possibly be doubted, and that includes your doubts. So since I found a way out of doubting everything, therefore skepticism is defeated. And you see, he isn't called the father of modern philosophy for the solutions he claims he found. Rather, it's because modern philosophy has accepted all the problems he came upon, but pretty wildly and almost unanimously rejected his solutions. So what we see in modern philosophy is the foundation Descartes found goes away, and most of all modern philosophy has now been spent searching for a new foundation, a new way to ground these things. This pushed philosophy in a much more skeptical direction than it was prior to Descartes, as J.P. Moreland has said, that skepticism prevails for entities that require the first-person perspective as their basic mode of epistemic access. And in my opinion, and I hope to demonstrate this by the end of the presentation here, this was also the wrong direction for philosophy to go in. Now, obviously a great deal can be said about Descartes' method, how he devised it and how he went about it. He was extraordinarily detailed, or at least he tried to be, but I've had to sum it up a bit, and here's how we can, I think, fairly sum it up. His methodology is to doubt everything that can be doubted. The only things that cannot be doubted are, as Descartes says, everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive, which simply means that if the act of doubting produces a logical incoherence, that doubt is disallowed. So we don't get to doubt tautologies like the cat is a cat, the bird is a bird. I don't get to doubt my own existence because that produces obvious contradictions and problems, so we can't do that kind of doubting. Now from this, if there's anything left undoubted, then that is certain, and as such, qualifies as knowledge. And we can clearly see how this leads to his, I think I am. But at the same time, it clearly shows a great deal of problems, because there's very, very few things that we claim we know which can't be doubted in this way. It's maybe his I think I am, maybe a few other things, but very, very few. So then almost everything has to be doubted, and if you reject Descartes' solution to this problem, you're kind of lost in a bit of skepticism, and that's more or less what happened. So how would Aquinas respond to this? Well, Aquinas never really asked the same question Descartes did, and at first this seems to be kind of an unimportant triviality, or perhaps an oversight on Aquinas' part, in that he missed something Descartes did, but we're going to see that that's actually due to the view of epistemology that Aquinas had, and that he didn't even need to ask the same questions that Descartes did, and rather he would probably have said asking them is a bit foolish. This is in that Descartes was trying to get at knowledge without assuming anything at all, and in many senses this is the grand problem that modern philosophy has been desperately trying to answer. problem is that it seems we need a foundation for our knowledge to be knowledge, but then we need another foundation to justify our foundation, and then something else to justify that, and so on ad infinitum. Now, Descartes believed he had found this absolute foundation that didn't need any further justification with cogito ergo sum, but he seems to have convinced himself on this and pretty much nobody else, unfortunately. So Aquinas never asked this, and we're going to see why this actually does solve the stuff. And Descartes wanted to assume nothing, but Aquinas would say this is just simply impossible. To quote Peter Kreeft on this, if Aquinas were challenged to answer this critical question, Aquinas would probably say you can't do epistemology without doing metaphysics, because what knowledge is depends on what is. Hence this modern question and Descartes' quest is simply unanswerable because it is self-refuting. Knowledge is always knowledge of something, which means there is always at least two things involved in knowledge, which means trying to find a single foundation for knowledge is nonsense. It's a bit like asking how the number 4 smells, what the color blue tastes like, or what the area of a square circle is. These questions can't be answered because they're simply meaningless. Hence, we need to assume something just to get started, and this is perfectly reasonable and commonsensical. We see this all the time. Even asking a question assumes knowledge to get something, and just saying no requires there to be something there to say no to. So we see that knowledge is always of something else, so to just assume nothing is impossible. Now, the account of knowledge that Aquinas does offer us effectively avoids or sidesteps the problems Descartes and his disciples got into. The important point to remember here is that when the questions you're asking lead to nonsensical and contradictory results, it might be wise to step back and rethink your questions. So we got Descartes there, Aquinas there, and Descartes challenging Aquinas. So what's he going to do? Well, we'll see here. The response I'm going to be using from Aquinas is in Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 85, Article 1, As stated above, the object of knowledge is proportionate to the power of knowledge. Now there are three grades of cognitive powers. For one cognitive power, namely the sense, is the act of corporeal organ. So the first part of Aquinas' response is that we actually see things. Although it's a little fairer and more accurate to say we observe and sense them. We don't just sense things with our eyes, we sense them with our noses, with our touch. We sense our own emotions internally, things along those lines. That's what he's getting at there. Continuing on, and therefore the object of every sensitive power is a form as existing in corporeal matter. And since matter is the principle of individuality, therefore every power of sensitive part can only have knowledge of the individual. So what we observe and sense are things that exist in matter. We don't see things that have no matter. Because of this, we only see individual things. Now, most of us have some general notion of how things should be grouped together, so we think of men and elephants as separate classes of things. The point here he is making is that we never observe these groups as groups. That is, I don't see elephants. Rather, I see lots of individual elephants, and then in my mind and speech, I group them together. Now, if you're having trouble seeing this, an easy way to understand this is to ask yourself the question, where physically is a corporation located? Now, it's actually quite difficult to answer that question other than in a general sense, like it's in that building or it's in that city, because a corporation is simply a grouping together of people and resources. We observe the people and resources individually, and then we group them together for various reasons and purposes. Now, we can talk about corporations and groups like this as if they're single entities, but they really never are. They're groups made up of other single entities, at least in the way we observe them. And that's Aquinas' second point, is that we sense and observe the individual, not the group. Now, there is another grade of cognitive power which is neither the act of a corporeal organ, nor in any way connected with corporeal matter. But the human intellect holds a middle place, for it is not the act of an organ, yet it is a power of the soul, which is the form, the body. Therefore, it is proper to know a form existing individually in corporeal matter, but not as existing in this individual matter. But to know what is in individual matter, not as existing in such matter, is to abstract the form from individual matter, which is represented by the phantasms. Therefore, we must needs say that our intellect understands material by abstracting from phantasms, and through material thus considered we acquire some knowledge of immaterial things. So what's he saying? What's he getting at in all this? Well, I'm going to tell you, and this is the chief point. This is the problem of universals. That's what he's touching on here. Now, this is probably the most tricky to get, but once you get it, you're going to see this. The position he is taking is that after we have observed these individual things, the third grade of cognitive power is where our mind abstracts off aspects of individual things, and thus we acquire knowledge of the immaterial. So to explain this, let's look at those elephants again. Oh, well, there's the problem of universals for you. So, we have an elephant and a battleship there. Now, they're both gray. I see these things as gray, and I certainly hope you do too, unless you're colorblind or something. But you're not seeing the gray removed from anything. You never see gray removed from something. It's always on something else. It's always part of something else. It's always a property of something else. So how is it that we have a conception of gray removed from something if we've never observed it that way? Well, that is the problem of universals. How do we get to that gray that is not on an elephant, a battleship, or something else? So once you understand that question, you grasp the point here, what the problem is. Now the simple solution would be to just simply claim these things don't really exist. They're kind of useful fictions that aren't really there. Sort of like how we assign value to money in order to live together, but it's not like it's useful other than what values other people assign to it. And that's the view of nominalism. And this, to just explain there, we think there's a gray that connects the battleship and the elephant, but nope. Nominalism says it's not there. And while he is generally thought of as an idealist rather than a nominalist, and this is correct, nominalism is actually the direction Descartes went, as we can see in his Principles of Philosophy. In the same way, number is only a mode of thinking, and the same is true of all those general ideas we call universals. However, this is not the direction that Aquinas will take us, and further, I'm pretty sure we can say he would argue that this is just a kind of thinking simply leads to self-contradiction. That is, if I say that all gray is simply a mode of thinking and all grays really are separate and distinct, then how can I even refer to these things as gray in order to say they are different? The very thought, all grays are different, is a contradiction, as I just grouped them together when I said all grays, but then said that is the very thing I can't do and must not do. I might as well start babbling on about how I can't talk in English. Rather, the position Aquinas will be taking is that such universals are real, but we only observe them in the individuals in the real world. And that is this third cognitive power and his third point, which is so key. It happens when our mind abstracts these universals off of these things and puts them together for us. Hence, there really are universals that connect the things we see together. So, what happens is, my mind's there are two gray things, my mind pulls in the gray and abstracts it off, and I have gray there, even though we never observe it in the world separate from these things. And this is his third point, my mind separates things that are not separate in the actual world. So Descartes still challenging Aquinas. We need to know how this answers Descartes. What does this do? How does Aquinas escape? Well, there are two mistakes Descartes made here that Aquinas' understanding of epistemology prevents, or at least makes it much, much harder for those mistakes to be made. First of all, Descartes thought all knowledge needed certainty. You need to have certainty in order to have knowledge. You need to have your mind resting on a certain foundation. But with the moderate realism, with what Aquinas is telling us, we simply realize this is not so. I have knowledge of what the color gray is and looks like from these many, many instances I see of it, and I can observe these individual things in the world to better my knowledge of them as I go on. I can pull the stick out of the water and abstract more things off it to conclude that it only appears bent when it's in the water, that my perception there was off, but I can realize it. And further, we can only learn this way, and we learn better the more we see, the better our knowledge of that universal becomes. Where with Descartes, if knowledge is only of things that are clear and distinct, then it's kind of questionable how we can ever learn anything, because if things are clear and distinct, then we know them and there's nothing more to learn. Second, Descartes thought the way to certainty was to doubt, and while there are instances where doubt is good and helpful, for example, I just spent this whole presentation doubting that Descartes found certainty, there are plenty of other instances where this is counterproductive and pushes us toward a never-ending type of skepticism. The obvious example here is what this whole presentation has been about, is in doubting the universals, which Descartes did with the nominalism he was pushing toward there, because then it's becoming questionable how we can know anything. So in that case, doubt actually pushes us away from knowledge. So to conclude here, it seems to me that as Descartes was a very educated man and Aquinas predates him by about 400 years, it's really quite likely Descartes read Aquinas, and probably even on this particular point. I find myself wishing that he'd either paid a little more attention to Aquinas or taken him more seriously, as perhaps then he would have seen that his whole project of methodological doubt was at best an interesting waste of time and at worst kind of a blunder. Now, if you're interested in reading more about this kind of stuff, I highly recommend this book, Socrates Meets Descartes by Peter Kreeft. It deals with many of these same issues I've just gone over, but in much greater depth, and it's written as a fictitious dialogue between Socrates and Descartes, so it's much more enjoyable than most philosophy books are to read. And further, Peter Kreeft is a modern-day Thomist who tries his best to follow in the footsteps of Aquinas, so you're going to probably see a lot of the same ideas and principles coming through in what he has to say. Here's citations for the quotes I included in the writing here. And here are my sources. And a second page of sources.